And it's really nice to be here with all of you. Let's just get started, I guess. There's a quick overview, and I probably brought too much, so I will have to hurry through some of this, but I'd like to leave plenty of time for some give and take at the end. But good, okay. I'm sure you are. So I want to go over with you a little bit about the history of these weak signal modes and how they work. But I'm going to concentrate primarily on the ones that might be interesting for HF contesting. That's FT4 and FT8. So I'll talk about their good features and so forth. Specifically, I want to talk a little bit about the whole idea of contesting with digimodes, because it isn't what most of you have done. I think when I checked the logs submitted in the worldwide DigiDX contest, which was only last weekend, or 2 weekends ago, the one that bridged over the end of August and beginning of September. I think there were 12 FRC logs in the logs submitted, but I don't know whether any of those 12 are here. Is that true? Okay, 1 or 2 anyway. Great. So we'll talk a bit about that. I'll tell you a little bit about why these modes are so sensitive, why they work so well at very weak signals. I want to talk a little bit about having opened Pandora's box and whether we're on a slippery slope of some kind that leads to places where we don't want ham radio to go. So I'll talk a bit about that. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the software itself, but not in great detail, but I want to emphasize a few issues about it. So let's start on this history business. WSJT was the name of the original program, which I started on in 2001. I was then, I had finished a term in the Princeton University administration. I returned back to the physics department as a professor teaching courses and so forth. But at that point, I was not taking on another steady stream of graduate students doing PhD work. And I thought, I better get back into ham radio. I'd sort of put it on hold for most of 35 years. Although my code speed was still good, and I never forgot that, and I had in fact kept some small amount of activity during most of those 35 years. Anyway, I was interested in doing EME, which I had always wanted to do as a kid. I was licensed first in 1954, and was very active during my later middle school and high school years. Then I went off to college and graduate school and so forth, and started losing time to do ham radio. And about 5 years later, so WSJT was designed to allow me to start doing meteor scatter again, which I'd had fun doing as a high school student, but also enabled me to do EME, moon bounce, for the first time. It was discovered at the time that some of the modes that we came up with were also good for HF-DXing. It's not what I designed them for, but people quickly found out that it works well. And so some people were playing around with it way back at the beginning. About 5 years later, I designed this program called MAP65, which enabled us to do EME, particularly on 2 meters, but on higher bands as well, 432, 1296, in a manner in which basically the receiver received the whole band, subband in which EME signals would appear. That's sort of, on 2 meters, that's from 144, 100, up to about 144, 60 or 65 or so, something like a little less than 100 kilohertz. But anyway, you could receive all the signals in that passband, all of the JT65 signals, and decode them all. And not only that, but you could, if you had a dual polarization antenna, elements, both horizontal and vertical, or maybe at 45 degrees or whatever, then you could do not only the multi-decode, but adaptive polarization. And that's important because on 2 meters and 432, most of the EME signals are linearly polarized. Most people would have horizontally polarized antennas if they're into weak signal work on those VHF, UHF bands, but they come back from the moon at some other polarization because they get rotated going through the ionosphere, going up and coming back again. So the received polarization, even if you emit horizontal, comes back any old polarization. You don't know what it is, but if you have both polarizations on your antenna, on your receiving antenna, you can in software adaptively adapt to whatever the polarization is. That turned out to be a huge advantage. In 2008, we came up with this mode that I call Whisper, weak signal propagation reporter. A lot of people play with that with very, very low power, 5 watts or even less, milliwatts sometimes. And that mode is very sensitive. You can, with a 1 watt signal, you can basically be heard around the world. And lots of people with have had fun playing with Whisper over the years. In 2012, we sort of got more modern and designed a new version of WSJT, the -X. I don't know what X stands for. We had to call it something else, extended or extra or experimental or something like that. But it now is the default program that everybody uses. And basically, it has adopted more or less all of the capabilities of the earlier ones. Today, there are something like 20,000 active users of WSJT-X around the world. The program has a number of derivative softwares. It's open source, so anybody can copy the source code and build their own modifications into it. And a few people have done that and distributed their modifications, and those are popular programs as well. So that's basically the history. This, you've probably seen this graph before. It's from Club Log, just showing that JT or FT8, which came along in the middle of the year 2017, took off like I don't know what, a rocket or something, and more or less spelled the end of JT65 and JT9. They were 2 of the earlier modes that had become reasonably popular for use on the HF bands. Those faded away. FT8 took over. I don't know whether the decrease in CW and phone here is telling us anything except that the sunspots have gone. So there's no propagation. But FT8 works well anyway, even with no propagation, if you like, or at least poor propagation, because it works well down below the noise level. This was completely unexpected, by the way. We had no reason to believe that the FT8 would become so popular, and I'll say a few more words about that. Here, by the way, it's just something just a couple of weeks ago, I got the Club Log report for just 1 week of uploaded QSOs to Club Log. And as you can see, FT8 is far and away the biggest one, and FT4 now is the second biggest. So that those 2 together comprise about 75%, 3/4 of the QSOs uploaded to Club Log during that week. CW and SSB are each about 10 or 11%, so that's almost the remaining quarter, and RIDI and everything else are only a couple of percent. Here's why. Why do people like these modes? Because they work at very low signal levels. An SSB signal has to be at least something like around 10 dB above the noise level in a 2.5 kilohertz passband. Copy it. And even at that level, you would give it a signal report of S2 or something, or S1, and you'd have to ask for repeats. RIDI works a little better. It gets down below the noise level. Remember, the noise here is always measured in the same fixed size bandwidth. So a RIDI signal can be copied below the noise level because the RIDI signal is much narrower than 2.5 kilohertz. Okay. Then the remaining modes on here, and then CW is down here. You can copy CW even a little weaker than a RIDI signal. A really good operator, one who's had trained himself or herself to copy really weak CW, can get down maybe to -15 on this scale. But at that level, a lot of repeats are necessary. You're not copying much. If you repeat it a lot, you can basically dig it out of the noise if you're good at it. Anyway, all the other modes on here are the modes in WSJT-X, and they have different purposes: meteor scatter, EME. JT9 was built for the bands down below the broadcast band, you know, the 2200 meter and the 630 meter band. They've become quite popular down there. Whisper is the most sensitive at all. How do you trade off the sensitivity against various other things? It's bandwidth and time. If you make the bandwidth really narrow, that means your receiver is picking up less noise. If the signal is also very narrow, then you can work at negative signal-to-noise ratios on this sort of scale. But if you slow it down, if you make the bandwidth very narrow, that usually means you also have to slow it down, so the transmissions will take longer. And I sort of decided at the beginning that I wasn't interested in modes that took more than, I don't know, a minute or so for a transmission. You know, some people have done this very, very slow speed CW where you can across the pond on 137 kilohertz, but you're using CW, but the dots and dashes are hours long, and it takes 2 weeks to make a QSO. That's fun for the record book, but that's not what we were interested in doing. So anyway, we first built this mode for moon bounce, and another mode that's not on here anymore for meteor scatter that's been replaced by a new one for meteor scatter. Anyway, that's the overall range of things that are in this program. I should mention before going on that particularly recently, a lot of the recent development work has involved these two guys, Steve Frank, K9AN. He's a now retired professor of electrical engineering at the University of Illinois. He is the F in FT8. F is Steve and Steve Frank. And he's contributed a lot to the software recently, particularly in the details of the new protocols, in the design of the waveforms, which is important, and I'll tell you about those in a minute. Design of the decoding algorithms and the optimization of the software to make it run fast and things like that, and the performance measurement. Bill Somerville is the only person in our group that I would call a real programmer. Steve's an engineer and I'm a physicist. You know, we have to know how to program a little bit, but we're not programmers. Bill is, and he's been very good at making the overall program structure better, easier to maintain, capable of running across Windows, Macintosh, Linux, all these platforms. That we thought that was a good idea, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not a one-man project anymore. It was up until about 2010 or so, but most recently it's not. So FT8 is the one with the yellow curve that was jumping off, showing it's so popular. That was introduced, just about 2 years ago, a little over 2 years ago now. I designed it together with Steve Frank, primarily for multi-hop sporadic E on 6 meters. That's what we were interested in when we were doing it. Those signals are often, sometimes they get strong, but they're often weakish, and they almost always have a lot of QSB. And so having to if you're doing digital QSOs, using the modes that we already had built into the program then, which had 1 minute transmissions, not only meant a QSO took 4 or 5 minutes after each station transmits a couple of times, exchanging call sign and signal reports and Rogers or whatever, because maybe by that time the band is folded or shifted or something. So we wanted a mode that was faster, but still maintained pretty good sensitivity. And it turns out that makes it really good for HF bands as well, although that was not the original design purpose. All of these modes use short messages, and they're structured messages, which means that we can build a lot into a small number of digital bits. And I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. This mode, FT8, uses timed transmit-receive sequences that last 15 seconds. So you get 4 of them in a minute. You can finish a QSO in about a minute. And it works down to signal-to-noise ratios around -21. Even better than that under certain limited conditions that I'll mention later. It turns out to be extremely effective for not only at VHF, which is what we had in mind, but also at HF, and it's become very popular for that reason. It allows you to make these fast, minimal QSOs. The QSOs consist of nothing more than calling CQ, exchanging call signs, and maybe a grid locator or a signal report, Rogers, and then you're done. It's in the log. So it's sort of like contest-like operation, an everyday operation. You don't rag chew. You can't, basically. You can send arbitrary messages, but they have to be only 13 characters long. You can't say much in 13 characters. Okay. So the protocol itself, just a few words about that, because I know you guys are technical and maybe interested in these details. We always compress the message information down to exactly the same number of digital bits. 77 bits is the message payload in each one of these FT8 messages. We add to that an error detection code, a 14-bit cyclic redundancy check. That makes 91 bits altogether. And then that 91-bit message plus error detection thing is further enhanced with error correction information that gets sent along with the original message. And the total number of bits in the whole thing is 174. So there's a redundancy in the message of about a factor of 2. That means that when the message is received, the decoder can try to take these received 174 symbols, we call them, little bits of information, and try to determine from that what 91 bits of information were used to generate them. And then, looking at the 91 bits of decoded information, check to be sure that if you take the first 77 bits and calculate the CRC from it, that equals the CRC that was actually received. And if that's the case, then you say, oh, this is a good decode. If it isn't, you just throw it away and say the decode failed. So it's a pretty bulletproof system. It has built-in forward error correction and then an additional level of error checking. To that, we add 3 so-called Costas arrays of information. You may, if you're familiar with the way Navy sonar works, they use Costas arrays. It's a way of encoding a waveform. It can be RF, it can be audio, in such a way that another station or receiver receiving this waveform can synchronize on both the frequency and the time of the signal that was transmitted. We need to do this because the message as received is only useful if we know exactly when it starts and what frequency its sort of origin is. And those are done by using these Costas arrays. We then modulate the signal in a 8-tone frequency shift keying. So it's 8 separate frequencies that can be only one at a time, can be keyed on and off. Ordinary radio teletype, RIDI, is 2-tone FSK, right? 2 tones with a fixed separation. This is 8 tones. And the G in here stands for Gaussian. This is Gaussian frequency shift keying. And I'll show you why that's important in a minute. That's turned out to be very important. The tone separation is equal to the rate at which these different tones are keyed onto the signal. RIDI, remember, is 45.45 baud. This is much slower than that. It's only 6 1/4 baud. The 8 tones means that the total bandwidth of the signal is 8 times 6 1/4, or 50 hertz. So the total bandwidth of this signal is about 50 hertz. The transmission duration is a little bit less than 15 seconds. That's so that the receiving station has a couple of seconds at the end of a transmission to decode it before it has to start transmitting again. Okay, got that? So, so here are the structured messages and their and the 77-bit payload amplified just a little bit more. So a standard message usually looks something like this: 2 call signs and either a Maidenhead grid locator, which tells where you are on the Earth, or this could be substituted by a signal report or Roger or 73, that sort of thing. So you can make up a whole QSO out of messages that basically look like this. Each of the call signs can be encoded in exactly 28 bits. The Maidenhead locator is such that you can encode all of those on the Earth to within a 4-digit locator in 15 bits. And then we add an additional 6 bits at the end, so the total is 77 bits. Those 6 bits basically allow us to have some slightly different message types. And one second message type is shown right here. That's the so-called free text message, which I mentioned. You can send anything you like up to 13 characters. So you can send things like that, but not much more than that. Now, the 6-bit message type indicator allows us to have special messages for special purposes. So here's the standard one. Here's the free text. We have a special way of dealing with non-standard call signs, things that are special event stations or have funny numbers in them, or maybe just a leading DXCC prefix slash and then your standard call sign. Any of those things are treated as non-standard call signs. They won't fit in 28 bits, so we have to have some special way of dealing with them. We can do that here with some other limitations on the message. There is this DXpedition or Fox and Hound mode that I know some of you have played with, and that is a special message type. And then we have special message types for each of originally 4 different types of contest exchanges. One was made for the North American VHF contest, the CQ and ARRL VHF contest, one special for the European VHF contest format, which is different. We made one for Field Day, and we made one for the ARRL RIDI Roundup. So those are all sort of built into it. And it turns out that the worldwide DX contest that was held just 10 days ago decided to use the same contest exchange as the North American VHF contest. So we fit it into here very nicely. We also have a sort of arbitrary telemetry message type, and there are others that we can develop in the future. Recent additions to these modes and to the program involve giving this FT8 this GFSK waveform. Originally, we just made it a standard 8-tone frequency shift keying. This makes an ultra clean signal, and I'm going to emphasize that going forward in a few other slides. We improved the waterfall display. We introduced this new mode called FT4, which is like FT8, only twice as fast, with a little bit less sensitivity. That's built directly and explicitly for contesting. We built in some nice features for blind hams, sight-impaired hams. We improved the inter-program communication so it can talk to N1MM, for example, for contesting. That turns out to work well. Still getting a few bugs out of it with those guys, but it worked effectively in the Digicontest 10 days ago. WriteLog also uses some of our code to enable the use of FT4 and FT8, and that's a recent addition. Now, what about this GFSK? What's the point here? The upper graph here, the vertical scale is frequency, the horizontal scale is time. This is a 4-tone frequency shift keying signal like FT4. In fact, that is a particular, it's a portion of an FT4 waveform as it was originally designed. Notice the sharp corners. When you transmit one tone for a fixed amount of time, and then instantaneously you jump to the next tone and so forth. That's the way standard ham RTTY works also. It's either one tone or the other, no gap, no transition, you just shift frequencies. The bottom curve is a GFSK waveform with the same information in it. And notice that it's basically the same, but the corners have been rounded off. Basically, you put some Gaussian smoothing through it in mathematical terms. And it turns out that has a rather small effect on the waveform. The same decoder can decode both signals, but it has a huge effect and an important effect on the spectrum of the signal, many dB down from the peak. And here's an example of that. Here is a standard FT8 signal with FSK frequency keying, and here is the same signal with GFSK. Notice that even at 80 dB down, it doesn't have side lobes in wings going out. On the same scale, same frequency scale, this is 0 frequency, this is 5 kilohertz up here. These signals are just on the same scale. That's what a RTTY signal looks like. You all know if you play RTTY contests that signals are wide at many dB down. So if you got a strong signal, he takes a lot of space, takes a kilohertz or more. But GFSK, FT8, and FT4 do not. That's why you can get a whole lot of them in a narrow slice. In one single sideband receiver passband, you can get 50 signals or so. Here's one, another one, just comparing on-the-air signals at a time when we had just introduced the GFSK modulation. Some of the guys were still using the old version of the program. I just happened to catch two signals here about the same strength at the same time. One of them has these wide bands. He was obviously using the old version of the program. Here's the nice new clean signal for FSK for FT8. So I'm a big promoter of clean signals. So just in summary, quickly, let's talk about some of the good features that these modes have and which have contributed to making them so popular, in particular for FT4 and FT8. Basically, we have, at least up till now, been able to manage with everybody operating at a single dial frequency, upper sideband. So you've got whatever filter you have in your single sideband receiver, typically 3 kilohertz more or less. If you can use more, so much the better. But there's a meeting place. You don't basically touch the big dial on your receiver. You set it there, and that's where all the FT8 activity is. It's in the next 3 kilohertz above that, and as I said, you can get 50 or more signals in there without overlapping. By the way, the decoder is also pretty good at decoding signals that do overlap, because after a signal is decoded, the receiving software can re-encode that information. It doesn't take much time, in milliseconds or less. So you know exactly what the waveform was for that received signal. You know what time it started. So you can subtract it from the received signal and then run the decoder again and see what was under that guy. And you can often decode two signals at the same frequency, plus or minus a hertz or two, in that way. That happens all the time with FT8 operation and FT4 also. So you decode all the signals in the passband, so you can see everybody that's on, who's calling CQ, who's working who. These decoders, I modestly say, are very good. I can even say that they reach the theoretical limits, basically. You can't do any better. And to a large extent, that it's been a lot of fun working on that with Steve Frank. Neither he nor I was trained in this kind of stuff. He did a different kind of electrical engineering, but he's a ham, so like all of us, he likes messing around with stuff. And I, since I retired, basically have been teaching myself communication theory, and I have access to a really good engineering library, of course, at Princeton University. But I actually like figuring out by myself first, and then I go and see if the engineers already knew what I think I figured out. And of course, they always did. I mean, it's not as though I'm not paving new ground here very often. But it is interesting that we're working in a different regime than communication theorists really work in, professional communications people, because we're trying to work very close to the noise level, where the signal-to-noise ratio that we care about is where it's basically at the limit. And they don't want to operate there. They want at least 10 dB more signal, so you've got some headroom and some opportunity for glitches and things going wrong. So we're in a different regime, and that means some of the ways to optimize decoders are somewhat different. Anyway, these decoders get you down to something like 17 and a fraction dB for FT4 and about 3 and a fraction dB better than that for FT8. Under the conditions that apply in a QSO after the first exchange of call signs, it's about 4 dB better than that, because for the subsequent messages, after you already know who you're working, in the subsequent messages, you know that your call sign is going to come first and his is going to come next. And the only thing you're still trying to find out is what was the rest of the message, the signal report or the locator or whatever, 73 or something. And so the decoder can get closer to the noise, because you can basically apply a priori information to the decoding algorithm. That turns out to be a standard technique which the engineers knew about and we figured out, and then we knew about it too. Anyway, that's the way we've gone about it. This decoding scheme means that you don't get partial copy. you never get a call sign, a busted call sign. If we're going to have digi contests with this kind of a mode, super check partial is irrelevant. We don't care about it. If I copy you, I know I got your call sign right. You never get one letter wrong or something like that. I like that. In fact, I never liked super check partial. It seems to me you ought to copy what you copy over the air, for God's sake. But anyway, I know it's used. All right, so let's talk about digimode contesting a little bit. Is this a good idea or what? Well, we've been playing around with it on the VHF bands because that's where my original interest was, going back to 2001, more or less. Because with FSK 441, FSK 144, that was the original meteor scatter mode that I designed in the early 2000s. That enabled you on 6 meters to work stations out to 1,000 or 1,100 or 1,200 miles anytime with meteor reflections. And the QSOs are not fast. They typically take 10, 15 minutes maybe. If you've got a big rig, maybe only 5 minutes. But it enabled you to get a lot of grid multipliers that you couldn't work on ordinary troposcatter on 6 meters. So you could build up your contest score. And a lot of us started doing that soon after the original WSJT was available. Moon bounce became an interest of mine right after that, and that started to become important for contesting starting around, I don't know, 2005, 6, 7. By 2008, it was such that in the big moon bounce contests, the ARRL EME contest every year, CW moon bouncing on 2 meters pretty much had stopped, and everybody was using JT65 instead because you could work smaller stations with JT65 than you could with CW, significantly smaller. FT8 started, that mode was introduced in 2017, and it started to become a significant factor in VHF contesting, at least in North America, soon after that. And if you look at the VHF contesting reflector on, what is it, contesting.com, I guess, there are a lot of messages about FT8, and they're not all friendly, as you might well guess. People don't like change necessarily, especially not when they were winning the contest with the old method. But the ARRL VHF contests have always been mode independent. You can work AM, FM, sideband, CW, whatever you want, pulse, it doesn't matter. It's a contact. And so these modes have always been legitimate in those contests, and they have changed the way people do it a bit. And that, as I say, people don't necessarily like change. And of course, FT4 is now available, although we haven't had much of a test of that in VHF contests yet. It was publicly made available in July of this year, and that was the CQ VHF contest was just after that. So there was some experience with that, but not much yet. At HF, we designed into FT8 in the message structure originally the ability to exchange the messages used in the ARRL RIDI contest. And I chose that one because that contest, like the ARRL's VHF contest, has always accepted QSOs in any digital mode. Now, 99.95% of the logs submitted only have RIDI in them. But in principle, you could have PSK or whatever you like, but any other digital mode. But none of those modes was really made with contesting in mind, and they weren't very fast. And anyway, they weren't competitive. But FT8 arguably could be. And so last year's, in preparation for the RIDI roundup in January of 2019, this year, the sort of a mock contest before that, or a contest with very short notice, was cobbled together called the FT8 roundup. And that was done in the first weekend in December last year. Anyway, it used the same rules as the ARRL RIDI contest, although they allowed only low power. And it turned out it attracted over 1,200 logs, a huge number of logs for a contest that had only been announced a month before. And these logs were from all around the world, all the states, most of the Canadian provinces. At least a couple thousand people were on the air for that contest. So it clearly was it attracted a lot of interest one way or another. And here are some of the first impressions that we got back on reflectors and so forth soon after that. Most people thought it was good for a first try. People had a lot of fun. Little pistols obviously could compete. They had fun. It was nice that in the RITI, if you're in the RITI contest, you say 599 in New Jersey or 599 Pennsylvania. In this contest, we had the same ability, but we sent real signal reports. So we didn't always send 599. We actually sent 539 or 529. The software was programmed to measure the signal strength and to exchange it. So that was nice, and people enjoyed having real signal reports instead of this 599 in a standard contest, or 5NN, is more or less a synchronizing tool, right? It's just what you send to help synchronize the message. All right. The 3 kilohertz windows, although they're kind of nice that you know where everybody's going to be, they get very crowded in a contest. And so we encourage people to move up the band. And of course, to a large extent, they didn't. So we just QRM'd each other. So I think people will catch on pretty quickly, but they hadn't caught on yet. Interestingly, with this mode, there's very little difference between a run station and a search and pounce station. You pick a frequency, and you don't call the other guy on his frequency. You call him on your frequency, because his software decodes everybody in the whole subband anyway. So he'll find you wherever you are. So it doesn't much matter whether you're calling CQ there or calling somebody else. It is slower than RITI, but not a lot slower. The best score had only 693 QSOs in 24 hours. So, top scores in a RITI contest would be over 1,000. But anyway, it was not way out of line. It was slower, but not a lot. So in January of 2019 was the ARRL RITI contest, and here are the number of logs submitted in these various categories in 2017, 18, and 19. And notice that in the single op, unlimited, low power category, there are 1,000 new logs this year. Those guys were all running FT8, I guess. I mean, maybe not, a few weren't, but almost all of that is the addition of FT8 into this contest. And there was 120 new high power operators as well. So the total number went up by more than 1,000, total number of logs. Obviously, some people had a lot of fun doing this and sent in their logs. And we also looked at user reactions after the contest, and here's a basic summary, but it's pretty much the same summary you saw before. People had fun. It was good for little stations. Single operator 2 radio worked well. Some people used that, and the top scores used it. It's still slower than RITI, but not, again, I mean, no difference. It's the same mode. And I think there were some suggestions that maybe multi-mode is not that great an idea. There ought to be a RITI contest and separately a Digimode contest for other modes like FT8. At least that's what some people felt. Partly because otherwise, if you're doing one mode or the other, there are a bunch of people potentially workable who are doing the other mode, and you're never going to hear them or copy them. Okay, so because FT8 seemed to fill all the bills for a good contest mode, except it was a bit too slow compared to RITI, we thought, well, let's try a faster one. And if you make it faster, it's going to take more bandwidth. So at the same time we made it twice as fast, we also cut down the total number of tones from 8 to only 4. So that means the bandwidth grows, but not as much as it would have grown if we'd stayed with the 8-mode model. That mainly is why we changed to 4-tone Gaussian frequency shift keying. Okay? But otherwise, the modes are essentially the same to the operator. Same message formats. It's twice as fast, uses about 60% more bandwidth, 80 kilohertz instead of, 80 hertz instead of 50 hertz wide. It's about 3.3 dB less sensitive than FT8. We had a practice contest back in May of this year, just basically to thoroughly debug and check out this FT4 mode. There's what my waterfall screen looked like during this 1 hour long practice mode contest. I made more than 60 QSOs in that hour, and you can see a lot of them happening here. You can see that these signals can all be lined up. This is 3 kilohertz of audio bandwidth from 0 to 3 over here. If you had a receiver with a little more bandwidth, you might have been able to see that some signals were even higher. But you could pick it. I mean, this was only a practice contest. There were maybe 200 guys on or something. Anyway, it checked it out pretty well. And the mode, of course, really got a shakedown 10 days ago in this worldwide Digicontest, sponsored by the Worldwide Radio Operators Foundation and the Slovenian Contest Club. It was on the HF standard contest bands, including 160. You could use either FT4 or FT8. You could only work a station once. So if you worked him on one mode, he's in the log. You can't work him again on the other mode on the same band. But you can work stations again on each band. And the exchange is your four character locator. That means that since when you complete a QSO, you know your locator and you know his, so your software can calculate the distance from you to him. And if you divide that distance by 3,000 kilometers and add 1, that's the number of QSO points you get for that QSO. So nearby QSOs up to 3,000 kilometers, that is, most of North America would only be 1 point QSOs. Alaska would probably be 2. Europe is 2. Australia is 5, etc. Get it? So DX contacts are a big plus. You want to work some of those. And the multipliers in this contest are made up of the first 2 letters of your 4-character locator. So we're here in FN20. FN is our Maidenhead field. And you want to work as many of those as possible. So working lots of grids in FN, FN20, 21, and so forth, that doesn't help. But FN and then FM and CM and so forth, those are all good. Those are multipliers. Okay? So the first impressions after this contest were, first of all, that the conditions really stank. The solar flux index was way down. A was 45, K was 6. But so signals were terrible. But after all, this is a weak signal mode, and we could still work lots of Europeans and so forth, even though those 2 days were about as bad as it's been for the last year. Distance scoring was really good for West Coast operators because for them, the European context counted a lot, even more than for us. And you'll see that in the scores that I'll show you in a minute. Once again, we learned, not surprisingly, that spreading out in frequency would be a good idea. You don't have to spread out nearly as much as you would with RTTY signals, which have these wide skirts and everything, but still 3 kilohertz is not really enough. So people did spread out some, but I think we'll learn to do it more. We also learned that since it's a 2-mode contest and it's just 1 click on your screen to change from one mode to the other, and each mode had a different target frequency of operation on each band, that means you could switch from the FT4 subband to the FT8 subband and gain another 3 dB of sensitivity and work some of the weaker signals. And it turns out it was a good rule of thumb to use the fast mode for rate, but use the slow mode for multipliers. And a lot of us did that. So here are just some of the things that people really liked. N1MM together with WSJTX, they worked very well. Write log together with the thing that W5XD calls DigiWrite, which is basically a copy of the signal processing parts of WSJT. That worked well for the people that used it. By the way, while we're talking about that, show of hands in this room, who uses N1MM in contests? Who uses write log? Only 2 or 3. Yeah. Okay. Well, we cooperated a lot with the N1MM guys because we wanted them to support it. The right log guys got a lot of urging to get in the game as well. And I'll come back to that anyway in a minute. SO2R worked very well for the people that used it. We had fun with the real-time scoreboard. I didn't even know where it was when the contest started, but I saw some comment about it, so I Googled it or something and brought it up. And I hadn't figured out how to configure my N1MM to automatically send data there. So I was uploading my stuff by hand, which I did because it was fun to see how I was doing. Anyway, the last I looked, there were about 1,260 logs submitted. So again, it got good support for, especially considering it had very short notice. And it's not at a very good time of the year. Everybody's still on vacation in August and whatever. The contest season hasn't really started yet. But anyway, that's when they had it. So let's look a little bit at the top scores in this worldwide Digi contest. Single op high power, almost 1,400 QSOs, 157 multipliers. There are only 300. The multipliers do count on each band. I mean, you can add up the ones on each band. So this doesn't mean that he worked 147 out of 320 some, whatever there are, fields. But he, the total sum of all the ones he worked on each band are shown there. So you can get a pretty good feeling. A couple of these calls, I didn't get the breakdown of their QSOs and multipliers. Notice that the biggest score for single op low power was an Australian with only 300 QSOs and 86 multipliers, a score of a bit over 130K. And I want to refer back to that in a minute, I will. So those are the top scores in the world. Here are the top scores in North America. Notice KR1DX came just slightly behind that VK3, but he worked twice as many QSOs and more multipliers. The whole reason the VK score is so big is all of his QSOs to Europe or to North America are 5-point QSOs probably. Makes a big difference. So it makes an extra interesting thing that you have to optimize in your planning for working this. Okay, there was a couple of multi entries that did really well. The really big multi entry was these guys in Brazil with 600K points. They had an outstanding score. Anyway, let's look a little bit more at the top claim scores in the world single operator. Here are the top ones in the high power category. AA3B isn't here tonight, I guess, but he's in red because he's one of your club members. And I showed the top 11 rather than the top 10, so I could include myself. That's my only excuse. All right. In fact, but I will say a little bit more about number 11 in a minute. Here are the breakdowns of QSOs and multipliers for these. Here again are these two guys that finished 1-2 in the worldwide single op low power. Anyway, you can see the points per contact for the Australian were almost 5. For KR1DX, they were a little less than 2. For me, they were only 1.5. I think that's probably because I'm a little pistol. I was running a single IC 7300 and dipole. So, I don't have any gain, whatever.
I help you with it.
Yeah. All right. So you can see what all is there. I just spelled out the fact that my QSOs were about half on FT4 and half on FT8. The multipliers were weighted toward the FT8 side, as you would expect. And that was my summary sheet on N1MM. Okay, what about future contests using these modes? We don't know quite how this may develop, but we do know that the ARRL VHF contests, 3 of them each year, that will continue to support these. The Radio Society of Great Britain has introduced some FT4 contests. They're not of interest to us because at least the ones they've announced so far are on 80 meters and they're in the early evening in the UK, so it's the middle of the afternoon here, and we can't work the UK on 80 meters then. So forget that. But there will be this FT4, FT8 roundup again, I presume, I guess it's the first weekend in December. There certainly will be the ARRL radio roundup in January next year, next field day. And I think the worldwide Digi people are happy enough about what they did with this contest that they'll do it again, presumably with about the same rules, maybe with some tweaking. What about multi-streaming, this fox and hound mode? Somebody should tell me, by the way, when I have to shut up. It's 8:15. Have I got half an hour or something? Okay, good. So what about multi-streaming? We introduced this fox and hound mode largely because of the expedition to Baker Island. And I worked closely together with Ned Stern's AA7A to make a system in which they could work more than one station at a time using FT8. And so what we did basically is just for the fox, you know, there's one fox and everybody else is a hound. So the DX station is the fox, and if you're trying to work them, you're one of the hounds, braying or baying, I guess it is, at the fox. So the fox basically adds together the audio signals for several different FT8 messages, offset by slightly more than their bandwidth. Remember, the signals are 50 hertz wide. We offset them by 60 hertz, so there's a little gap between each one. And we allowed the fox to transmit up to 5 of these. But because we're adding together these signals before the modulation, that means that although the original signal is a constant envelope waveform, always the same amplitude, just frequency changes a little bit, but the amplitude is always the same. Once you add together signals with different frequency components, it'll no longer be a constant envelope waveform. That means that to avoid flat topping in your transmitter, you have to reduce the amplitude of each one by 1/n, where n is the number of signals you're adding together. That means the power goes down as 1/n squared. That means if you're putting 3 signals together, each one of them is down by about 10 dB, 1/9, almost 10 dB. If you're putting 5, that's 21/25. That's 15 dB, I guess. So it's a lot. However, the fox was going to run high power, and he's probably going to be working a lot of hounds that are running low power. So we figured, okay, he can probably at least get away with a 10 dB difference in his signal strength and the ones that he's trying to work. And that, in fact, turned out to be pretty accurate. Also, although adding together these multiple signals means that it's like doing a 2-tone test in your single sideband system to see how linear your amplifier is. When you do a 2-tone test, you see the higher order intermodulation products, and if you drive your amplifier too hard, those products get strong and you got splatter. Well, the same thing is true of this, but the fox, after all, is a de-expedition. Nobody else is transmitting when he is, particularly not with FT8, because that's a timed sequence mode, so that when he's on, everybody else is listening. So if he's QRMing anybody, it's himself, and we don't care if there is QRM down at minus 20 dB or something below individual signals. Nobody cares. So in that particular circumstance of a sort of many trying to work one, it doesn't matter much if the signal transmitted by the one has sidebands, has QRM out sidebands. And I'll show you what these signals look like. But in general, I'd say the signals, when you add a bunch of these together, you're going to get weaker signals, and the spectrum is going to be relatively ugly. And anyway, we thought this is acceptable for the one-to-many situation, but it's unacceptable for contesting. We never intended fox and hound mode to be one that anybody should use for contesting. Here is some examples of these ugly signals. This one is not ugly. This is a GFSK FT8 signal measured on the same transmitter that's sending it. It's a flex. Apparently, a flex has the ability to measure its own transmitted waveform and its spectrum. Anyway, so W5XD, the right log guy, did the spectra to convince himself that what I was telling him was true, namely that if there are a bunch of these signals and use them in the Fox mode, you'll get an ugly signal. So here's what 1 looks like. Here's what 3 looks like on the same scale. Sorry, that's what 2 looks like. And here's what 3 looks like. They really get ugly. And although, you know, these things are, this is a good system. It's a good flex system, well adjusted. I think it even has pre-distortion built into it, you know, which makes the amplifier more linear. But still, these things are only 25 or 30 dB down. That's not acceptable, I think, or shouldn't be acceptable for at least not for the way we design a system. If somebody's amplifier works badly, that's not my problem, that's his problem. Anyway, so this is my answer to, is this sum of waveforms multi-streaming acceptable? I say yes for a rare de-expedition, but basically for any other mode, any other type of operation, it's not a good idea. It is definitely not good engineering practice. Okay, I want to say a few words then about what FT4 and FT8 do under various propagation conditions. You'll notice that in that table I showed of detection, decoding signal noise ratio limits, I quoted these to a fraction of a dB. And I did that because we can measure that to a fraction of a dB very accurately by, and we can do that for a particular propagation model, which is namely the signal is corrupted by noise, but the noise is ordinary, random, additive white Gaussian noise, and there is no additional propagation effects like multipath or fading of any kind, Doppler spread, any of that stuff. So the basic model under which these threshold sensitivity levels are quoted for all of these, but in particular for those two, which I quoted to a decimal place, that's the model known as additive white Gaussian noise, nothing more than that. But of course, ordinarily we have propagation issues as well. So it's interesting to know how well these things perform under real propagation conditions, or something much closer to real propagation conditions. And the International Telecommunications Union has propagation models, which they use as standard models for propagation on HF frequencies. And they basically are, we start off here with additive white Gaussian noise. That's the one over here at the left. That's the one that has minus 20.8 dB sensitivity. And when we quote a sensitivity, what we mean is that at minus 20.8 dB signal to noise ratio, there is a 50% probability that the signal will decode. If it's weaker than that, the probability for decoding is maybe not 0, but it's less than half. And if it's stronger than that, it's up here somewhere. And notice that the curves are steep. So basically only 1 or 2 dB makes all the difference between no copy at all and basically 100% copy, perfect copy. That's for additive white Gaussian noise. Then you have mid-latitude quiet conditions, mid-latitude moderate conditions, mid-latitude disturbed conditions, near vertical incidence, whatever that stands for, I forget, etc. Then low latitude moderate, high latitude moderate, low latitude disturbed, and high latitude disturbed. Notice that, for example, for high latitude moderate, you give up about 5 dB. The signals are that much disturbed. The sensitivity is only about minus 15 dB instead of minus 20 point something. And high latitude disturbed signals, ones that go over the pole more or less, forget it. They're not copied at all. Basically 0% all the way along here. So even if the signal is strong, you're not going to copy it in FT8. That's interesting. In CW, you probably could copy those signals, although you might have to slow down, send a little slower, those are fluttery signals that have Doppler spread and everything else. Interestingly, for FT4, we should be able to predict that these curves will move to the right because FT4 is less sensitive. So these things will move over to in here somewhere. But this one may move to the right by less because the FT4 transmission rate is faster, so that a little Doppler spread doesn't make as much difference. And we might see that the high latitude disturbed ends up being copyable after all, and indeed it does. We build our own simulator that simulates all of these propagation conditions, and therefore we can measure thousands of generated signals through our decoder. And Steve Frank and I have a lot of fun doing that. Anyway, we know that these are roughly what the situation is going to be. So basically, almost all normal propagation conditions for FT4, you get into this range. And even with polar paths, you'll be able to copy if the signals are reasonably strong, and maybe you have to have a couple of tries to get a good copy. All right, let me talk about opening Pandora's box. There she is. So I'm told. A little bit about ham radio ethics, and in particular, Digimode ethics. These are weak signal modes. So somebody was asking me at dinner time, what about the guys that are running 1500 watts with FT8? Well, I would just say that usually you certainly don't need that. You don't even need 100 watts. Usually you can work the world with 30 watts, 10 watts. Depends on conditions. If you're trying to work the world on a 160, you may need high power. And in a contest, well, I'm not going to tell anybody what they can or can't do. And somebody is going to want to be loud. But it's also true that you probably don't need it. My input to the committee designing the rules for that worldwide Digicontest was, let's make it 100 watts max. But I got voted down. So anyway, I guess if you build a big station, you'd like to be able to use it. Interesting enough. How much spectrum should be permissible? Well, that depends on the mode and so forth, of course, but at least I think we ought to say you should, if we're designing these modes, you should design it with good engineering practices that allow you to have sharply defined signals in frequency that don't have these wide skirts like a RTTY signal. RTTY technology, after all, is 1930s technology, and we ought to be able to do a lot better than that 90 years later. I've already talked about when fox and hound mode is okay. What about, there's a fair bit of automation built into these programs now. Our robotic QSOs, which are obviously possible, are they real QSOs? I don't like it, and we intentionally designed WSJT so that you can't do that. Every QSO has to be started by an operator action that either calls CQ or answers another station. And it'll complete the rest of the QSO automatically because the messages are sort of prescribed, but it won't start another one unless you're there and do it. But the program is open source. Anybody who knows how to program can download it. They can disable that feature that turns it off, and some have done that. Others that maybe aren't good at programming figured out a way around it anyway, because you can buy software that basically clicks buttons on some other software, and so it can just keep clicking the button. So anyway, so that's partly why I asked the question here: should the software be open source? I wanted it to be that way from the beginning for lots of reasons, because I wanted to share the information. I wanted to share it particularly with other people that were interested in contributing to it, and I knew that any of us is not going to be here forever, and we're gone. Somebody else is going to have to take over if any of this stuff survives. So it should be open source. This is a hobby, after all. We ought to help each other out, not keep it suppressed. What about automation? These are the kinds of questions we ought to ask ourselves. Auto CQing, well, that's been in contesting software forever, so it's probably okay. Auto logging, once you've got a call sign and whatever the exchange is, you hit return, yeah, it goes in the log. by itself. That's okay. Super check partial, I've already said I don't much like it, but it's there and people use it, and I don't think we're going to get rid of it. What about auto answering somebody else's CQ? I think that's not basically in most contesting software now, because you got to copy the call and type it in or something, and maybe it'll answer. But with something like FT8, it would be easy to make it do that if you wanted it to. And so we did, in fact, allow that. There's a little button on FT8 screen that says call first. That means that if I call CQ and somebody answers, respond to the first one that you decode. Okay, so then it'll do the QSO, and then it'll stop, so it won't do another one. Well, so that's where we drew the line, but somebody else might draw it somewhere else. If we make a calling stack in a contest, say, we could stack up calls that we want to call. Can we allow the software to pick one out of there and call him? That ought to be up for discussion. What about calling another CQ after logging a QSO? I said we don't do that, but you could argue that, well, maybe you should allow it. If you do, then you're basically going to have robotic QSOs of some sort, and maybe we want to draw the line there. And anyway, we're operating here in a regime which is obviously going to ask a lot of questions of this kind. And are we on a slippery slope that's going to get us somewhere undesirable? If you care about whether you've worked a robot or not, these are stations that I've found myself to be on the air. Other people are decoding them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're obviously robots. There's no question about it. And the total list we have is a lot bigger than that. So how could we control this? Well, ARRL passed some kind of a resolution at their July board meeting that says such QSOs with robots don't count for DXCC or contests. Well, they can say that for their own things, but not everybody cares what ARRL says worldwide. And in any case, if some little guy trying to work DXCC works one of these, he worked them in good faith. Maybe it should count for him, but not count for the robot? I don't know what you should say, but it's a question. And finally, let me just say a few comments about the software development issue itself. Here's basically what your options are if you would like to use FT4 or FT8 for contesting. You can use our program, WSJTX. It's free, it's open source, it's licensed under the so-called General Public License version 3, which basically says anybody can copy this software, anybody can change it, modify it, do something else with it, incorporate it into their own software. But if they do that, the resulting software must also be licensed under GPL version 3, and the source code must be made available to others. So it's based, I mean, this is a license created by the so-called Free Software Foundation. And we use it just because it's a formal thing, it's well-defined, and so forth. So there are, I mentioned there are some derivative programs that have taken our code and modified them and done different things with them. One of them is called JTDX. It's basically got the DX parts of WXJTX, but not the meteor scatter and EME stuff. It's basically for HF operators primarily, and it doesn't have the contesting stuff in it either. So it's not, I didn't put it on this slide because you guys are contesting. Anyway, you wouldn't use that. But that's written by a Russian. It's mostly got our code in it, but he's cleaned it up in various ways, made it simpler for DX type operators to use. This guy, LS2HV, is his call sign, and he also took our software and copied it and modified it and made his own version. He was originally interested in the VHF stuff, but more recently he's gotten into the HF parts of it as well, and you can download his program and use it. It is free, it is open source, and it complies with our GPL version 3 license, although we've had to badger him a bit from time to time. He originally didn't make the software open source and freely available. So we said, you're in violation of our license. The last thing I want to do is get into any legal battles. I have no interest in that, but at least I beat on them a little bit until he complied. The N1MM guys we've worked closely with. Their software, of course, is free. It's not open source, so you can't take their software and modify it. But we worked closely with them to use N1MM for FT4 or FT8 contesting means you also have to be running WSJTX on the same computer or a networked computer, and that works well, and people have gotten used to using it. And they've found it effective. Now, WriteLog is a proprietary program, and he charges you. Not only he charges you $30 to download it, he charges you $30 every year if you want to be supported and up to date. To do that and to use our software, which he basically needed if he wanted to use FT4 and FT8, because he knows nothing about encoding, decoding, algorithms and that kind of thing. He's good at the user interface and the rig control and CW and so forth. But anyway, he needed to take our software. In order to make it sort of compatible with our license, he basically makes WriteLog work together with a separate program that he calls DigiWrite, which implements FT4 and FT8 with our code primarily. And he makes that part of it free and open source in GPL version 3. Now, it's a little bit arguable whether lawyers should get involved here or not. I mean, I think any reasonable person would, using this combination, would say that those two programs together, which use a shared memory block to send data back and forth to each other, are effectively operating as one program. And therefore, if you read the small print in GPL version 3, it says this combination is not in compliance with our licensing requirement. So what to do? I don't know. I could badger him and threaten him and so forth. I don't think I want to do that for lots of reasons. I don't think it would be good for ham radio. I don't think it would be good for us. And I don't really care if he does this that much, although it pisses me off. but anyway, so it turns out there is a clause somewhere in GPL version 3 which says we could make this combination GPL version 3 compliant if we, the authors of the original software that gets copied to make this piece, write into our license an exception clause, and that says WriteLog, or maybe some ham radio programs that are not GPL may still use this portion of our code as a coding engine or a coding and decoding engine or something, blah, blah, blah. I don't know quite how we would word it, but we could do that. And maybe we will. I don't know quite what we'll do. I just thought those guys here who said they use WriteLog, which were only a couple of you should know you're using a program that pisses me off, but not by that much. So anyway, I think I've talked long enough, guys. I'm going to wind it up there, but I would be more than happy to take questions as long as you want to go. Yeah. Yeah. No, not really. I mean, a standard motherboard sound card is fine. Whatever's in your laptop is fine. There's no reason to buy a expensive sound card. The reason is basically the same reason that your receiver sensitivity is, after all, set in your input stage, particularly on the high frequency bands. So, yeah, that's a good question. So, I've been a very poor predictor of how these various modes will be used by hams. We designed them with one thing. I mean, I designed JT65 for moonbouts, and it became very popular on the HF bands until something better came along, and that was FT8. And and we didn't predict that. We didn't expect that in either case. So what else? We're not going to make another mode even faster than somebody said. Well, where's FT2? I don't think that's likely going to happen because why? Already, even FT4 uses transmissions half the length of FT8, 7.5 seconds, and so the actual transmission is only 4.8 seconds or something, because you've got to leave a little bit of time for the decoder to operate. And to make it much shorter, you would start to give up a big fraction of the total time when neither station is transmitting. That doesn't make sense.
One last question. In 1958, 1959, I was with 6 meters AM, and I spoke to 2 brothers in Riverton, New Jersey.
That's us. Yeah, that was us. Yeah.
He always said he was the
Well, maybe he was. I'm sorry to say my brother Hal died in 2002. We had many very enjoyable times doing ham radio, first as kids and then later in life, particularly after. He also became a physics professor. He taught at Stockton College down near Atlantic City. He died of bone cancer, and I miss him a lot. We would have had a lot of fun doing FT8 and stuff together. He didn't see any of this stuff done. He died just about when it was starting. In '58, in January of '58, he and I together did a multi-op in the January VHF sweepstakes, which was not only the top score in the country, but it wasn't beat for about 20 years, I think, after that. So, yeah, right, something like that. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question which you may not like. Before I ask it, let me say that I think this FT4, FT8, this is great stuff. It opens radio up for a lot of different people using it from the antenna restricted areas. There's a lot of really wonderful things about it. But there's one thing that bothers me a bit, and it is that for the most part, at least as I understand it, and I have to confess I haven't operated FT8, so I may be totally wrong about this.
Okay.
I'm hoping you can tell me I'm wrong. But I think that this mode almost entirely removes all skill requirements from the operator.
Well,
Even in rig, like in CWB,
yeah.
like GDO there, can pick a call sign out of a pileup
Yeah.
that sounds like a Manhattan traffic jam. Every time. He's got a skill that's just unbelievable. And even in rig, there's a question of tuning accurately, and there's timing when you transmit. But this is all removed from the operator.
there's no question there are.
But there's got to be something left, is what I'm asking. Okay? I'm hoping there's something left. Like, for example, you talk about a call stack. If you can see power levels and you choose who you're going to call, then there's a skill required.
Yeah.
At least
Yeah.
some level of operator involvement. And so I just,
Well, I understand your question perfectly, and basically it's perfectly clear that there are different skills involved, and arguably fewer skills, I guess. At least you don't have to train yourself to be either a fast CW operator or a really skilled SSB operator that can pick call signs out of a jumble of a pileup. The skills involved are going to be different. They're going to be deciding on a frequency, moving around when necessary, deciding whether to say in the worldwide Digi rules, whether you want to concentrate on working more distant stations or nearby ones. You can pick out the stations to call based on their signal strength or their locator. So no question the skills are different. If you think it's all automatic, I invite you to see if you can work 1,000 stations in a weekend with FT8. It's not that easy. And the guys that did it have developed skills. And by the way, you can't just download the software and operate in the contest next weekend. You better get some practice time in, or you won't do very well.
So then there are skills, not the
Yeah,
skills.
but you may well decide that this ain't for me. I really like CW or whatever you say. I really do too. I love, for example, the 160 contests, both the CQ and the ARRL one. They've always been a big attraction for me, and I love doing those CW contests. But that doesn't mean I don't have fun doing the Digi contests as well. So, in this Digi contest, where, as I said, at least in the low power category, was in the top 11, as I like to call. I was a fair bit of the time I was doing things that I wanted to ascertain for myself what the what other people were doing. So I wasn't necessarily trying to run flat out all of that time. I think because I've operated these modes a lot, I knew that I could have optimized things in a better way, but I wanted to see what was happening on different bands. I changed bands a lot more than I might have otherwise and things like that. I wanted to see if people were spreading out on the lower bands as well as the higher ones, things like that. Anyway, I think people that operated in it, even the ones that said CW forever, or the ones, I think this club, as I understand it from reading your club history on your website, the club was pretty reluctant to get into RIDI at all, right, for years, and finally some of you started
Reluctant to get into phone.
even into phone, yeah, right, yeah, right, yeah. So we like to do things the way we always did them. Okay, yeah. I don't think I got the thrust of your question. Yeah. Oh, I see. And yeah, sure. I mean, if he can work with our licensing requirements, we'll be happy to do the same sort of thing we did with N1MM, say. And I don't remember what his licensing system is. Is his program open source? I'm not even sure. I don't know. Yeah. In principle, we'd be open to all comers there. And as it has worked out, we've even, not entirely willingly, but in practice worked out with a proprietary software vendor of WriteLog, and I think that's probably good on balance. We'll try to do that. Yeah.
I have a question here on behalf of the audience in the webcast.
Oh yeah, sure.
This comes from Mike K3RL. He wants to know, would having a very wide very wide band SDR be useful for receiving and decoding?
Oh yeah, good question. So he wants to know if a wideband SDR would be a big help. The answer is yes, in the sense that you could say if you opened up a bandwidth of 10 kilohertz or so, not only you would see all the guys down in the first three, but you'd see how much other people had spread out. If there's starting to be activity moving up, you could join them and work a bunch of stations with a very small amount of QRM. The way the software is built, it can decode a band up to 5 kilohertz. So most of our SSB receivers with their filters set at the widest we have only go up to 3, 3.5, maybe 4. So we're giving up a little bit there. The software will accept up to 5. In principle, there's no reason we couldn't accept up to 20 or so. After all, the program that I wrote for Moonbounce, MAP65, decodes almost 100 kilohertz. And we could do that again. But because here the target operators are guys that have SSB transceivers, we expect most of them only have 3 kilohertz or so. So that's what we aimed it for. As SDRs become more widespread, we could easily rework the program to accept a much wider band.
I have a question about the time. So there are some stations that their times are off.
Yeah.
But I know other stations compensate theirs so they can make a QSO with them.
Okay. So these are synchronized transmissions, and so your computer's clock has got to be set pretty accurately to UTC. Pretty accurately for the original EME-based modes meant the receiving software would look for signals that were offset in time by anywhere from -2 or 2.5 seconds up to about +5 seconds. The reason we made it asymmetric like that is because the travel time to the moon and back is 2.5 seconds. So you expect the moonbound signals to come in at +2.5 seconds, but maybe a little more, maybe a little less. And the terrestrial signals should be centered around 0, but maybe plus or minus a couple of seconds. When we made the faster modes like FT8 and FT4, we had to narrow down those windows a little bit more. FT8 covers about plus or minus 1.5 seconds. FT4 more like plus or minus 0.7 seconds. And that just means you have to set up your computer so that it regularly checks with a reliable internet source for the time. And that's straightforward. There's downloadable free software that'll do this for you, but you've got to configure your program, your computer to do this. And some people have had trouble doing it. And if you're operating in a place where you have no internet access, then you need a GPS receiver, or you actually can do it with WWV and hitting return on your keyboard at just the right time to set your clock, but I don't recommend that. It's not that easy.
There are stations that are off a little bit one way,
yeah.
And you might be off a little bit the other.
Yeah, and if the sum of those differences is too big, you won't decode.
I know there are stations that have, that's part of the skill that Steve was talking about, so they can decode.
True.
They actually offset.
They offset their time, and
so they can work the other stations.
There's a little downloadable app written by W9MDB that does that to your computer clock. You can just say add 0.7 of a second or something and move it back and forth. Yeah. Anybody else?
You made a comment about high power is not needed.
Yeah.
Now, is it not needed to make a contact, or it's not needed for contesting? Were the high power scores bigger than the low power?
Oh yeah, they were.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, a fair bit bigger. Because among other things, if you're loud, you're going to take a lot more people are going to be calling you. So, yeah. I mean, those signals, most of their QSOs, I think, of the high power stations at the receiving station had signal to noise ratios that were at least 10, maybe 20 dB stronger than they needed to be perfectly decoded. But that helps them to establish a clear frequency and all the rest of it. So, yeah, right. Yeah. Thanks, guys. This was great fun. Thank you. Yeah.